Welcome to the NAA Legislative and Regulatory Update. I'm Nicole Upano, AVP of Housing Policy and Regulatory Affairs for the National Apartment Association, and I'll be your guide through today's presentation. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be a returning speaker to the IRO Summit presented by Yardy Breeze and NAA. First, I wanted to thank Chris and the entire Yardy Breeze team for their partnership and for making sure that this is a great event year after year. Secondly, I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your continued engagement in our session, and we really appreciate your engagement. So let's dive right in. Today's presentation will have three main focus areas. First, we'll want to discuss our progress on the industry's legislative priorities in the 118th Congress. Then I'll catch you up on the deluge of White House and federal agency activities that you may have missed since January. Certainly, these are things that could impact industry operations and to some extent very significantly. Finally, we'll want to close with what state and local trends the NAA is tracking, because as these things start on the coast, they typically move inward, so we want to make sure to keep these things on your radar as well. As the leading voice for the rental housing industry in DC, our main job as your advocate is to bring your experiences and the realities of the business of being a housing provider to the policy deliberations that are happening in Washington. The connection between those things drives the solutions we propose and our legislative priorities as well. Our goal is to pursue a policy agenda that enhances, not diminishes, property management, operations, development, and investment. And we would want to work with all sides to ensure that we can increase quality housing options for renter individuals and their families. You'll see this through line through our big three. Here are our 2023 federal legislative priorities. First, we want to end the CARES Act notice to vacate requirement, which has been lingering since 2020 and continues to cause operational challenges. And again, as I said, we are working with all sides to increase quality rental housing options for renters. And the best way to do that is through long-term and short-term sustainable solutions, like lowering local barriers to development so that multifamily development can increase and we can lower that pressure on rents. And we want to make sure that we're working to improve the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program to set it up for success and make sure that it is a reliable option for folks who have persistent financial challenges and need assistance with housing. So let's start with the Respect State Housing Laws Act. Why do we need to eliminate the CARES notice to vacate requirement? Well, as you all know, during the fog of the early days of the pandemic, Congress passed the CARES Act eviction moratorium. This included an emergency notice requirement that said that housing providers must give their residents 30 days advance notice before moving to evict them for non-payment. This was intended to be an additional notice requirement during the height of the pandemic emergency, but it persists today because of a drafting error. And we know that it continues to cause significant challenges in courts today. Here are the main reasons that we continue to urge lawmakers that this is a serious problem that requires their attention. First, it extends the eviction process locally. By our count, the average notice period is 8 days. And as you can see from the infographic on the screen that we use to communicate this to policymakers, that this is a long process that if the 30-day notice is not given and it's challenged in court, even though the required notice period has been given according to the established process locally, if that 30-day notice has not been given, it can restart the clock and cause serious delays in the processing of legitimate evictions. And now that we're into 2023, it is very unlikely that those evictions for non-payment are include or are related to debt from the CARES Act. So why is this emergency requirement still being contested in courts? The CARES Act only was in existence, the moratorium, from March 27th to July 24th, 2020. So just keep that in mind, that years later, folks around the country are still dealing with challenges related to this requirement, this drafting error. It also adds to existing rent losses. One NAA member conveyed to us that they had to write off $10 million in debt last year. That's $3 million so far this year and $300,000 just this month. We know this is a significant issue for the industry, and we're continuing to work all avenues to get it fixed. Unfortunately, this is a controversial topic, and I'll tell you why. Policymakers, they don't want to be seen as taking away renters' rights, particularly with their constituents with an election year potentially upcoming. We're trying to correct that misnomer and help them understand, for the majority of policymakers who are not housing providers and don't understand why this is unfortunately a critical legal right for housing providers and renters. Eviction is a critical legal right that shouldn't be interfered with. We want to help them understand this is removing an additional emergency notice provision that will not affect the protections that tenants have always been afforded to according to the laws and the eviction process where they live. It's helpful to have data about the financial impacts that I mentioned. So if you are in a position to do so and you can provide us with that kind of anonymized data, that would really help us drive this advocacy initiative and fix this issue for the entire industry moving forward. The Respect State Housing Laws Act eliminates the CARES requirement from the law, and it essentially removes the question mark as to whether it should be in effect, still be in effect or not. We want to return control of the eviction process back to state and local governments where it should be. As I mentioned, NAA is continuing to educate policymakers on this issue and encourage bipartisan support. For our part, we also want to help policymakers connect the dots with how this will negatively impact the cost of housing for renters in the long run. According to NAA's dollar of rent data, which we will be updating 2023 numbers very soon, 91 cents of every dollar of rent goes to property management and operations, to paying employees a living wage, and the biggest parts of a dollar of rent are 31 cents of every dollar go to the mortgage, and 17 cents of every dollar go to operational expenses like insurance. As these costs go up, and sometimes dramatically, like with insurance, as we've heard from many of you, housing providers must make tough decisions just to remain solvent. So we're trying to help them connect all of these dots and help them understand this issue's true importance. As I said, we're working diligently, exploring every avenue to get this fixed, including the appropriations process. It's strategies like that that will help get this language moved more quickly than it would as a standalone bill. But this is certainly the Respect State Housing Laws Act is a marker that needs to be put into the process to make sure that language can be considered appropriately. So let's pivot to the YIMBY Act. As I'd mentioned previously, we are deeply invested in balanced and sustainable solutions that resolve the nation's housing affordability and availability challenges. Our top priority in terms of long-term solutions is we want to incentivize local governments to lower barriers to development of multifamily so that housing supply can increase more exponentially. To put this importance into context, local barriers, as you all know, hamper our ability to add to housing supply. They put upward pressure on rents, and they make ideas like rent control look more attractive. This is why the YIMBY Act is so critically important. It encourages government bodies that receive CDBG funds, which is virtually all state and local governments, to report on how they are removing barriers to development. This increases transparency and encourages more thoughtful and inclusive development practices. And this is truly where the power of the federal government can make a difference. In terms of short-term solutions, we're certainly very focused on the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. Why is this important? As we talked about, this is critically important for us to be supportive of and proposing sustainable and balanced both long-term and short-term solutions to help policymakers more easily avoid those urges to put into place quick fixes. For those of you who don't participate in the Section 8 program, this flowchart shows the leasing process for a voucher holder and compares it to that gray box that you see there at the bottom, which shows the very straightforward standard leasing process. Our goal is to set up the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program and make sure it's set up for success and reduce all of the red tape that you can see on the top half of that infographic that discourages housing providers from participating. The best way to incentivize enthusiastic industry participation is by putting into place solutions that are in the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. Keep in mind, and we keep reminding policymakers of this, that on average, 10,000 housing providers left the voucher program between 2010 and 2016, according to HUD's own data. We want to remind them that it's not the source, it's the strings that are really the challenges to the voucher program success and to voucher holders finding good quality housing. So much like I said for the YIMBY Act, we want to dissuade policymakers from quick fixes. The quick fix that they're contending with here is source of income fair housing protections, which is adding source of income as a protected class to the Federal Fair Housing Act. This would mandate that housing providers have to take Section 8. It would do nothing to fix the inherent problems with the program, and it wouldn't add a single unit to the voucher program. So this quick fix just won't do it. We really need to invest in these balanced and sustainable solutions like the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. You can see a number of the policy solutions that we're supportive of on the screen, and you can see that they're all win-wins. They allocate resources for landlord liaisons for PHAs so that housing providers can have a consistent contact at the PHA when they have challenges with the program and with potentially with voucher holders during the lease period. It provides incentives for private sector participation, including encouraging housing providers to put units in areas of opportunity into the program. It also ensures that renters have resources for security deposit assistance. This helps housing providers mitigate their risk and encourages more of them to participate in the program. And last but not least, it does also streamline the inspections process, which we often hear is a major barrier to entry for housing providers to participate in the program. This would allow for voucher holder renters to get into their units faster and would allow for pre-approval of inspections, which would be a win-win for everyone. So where are we on these bills? We already talked about the Respect State Housing Laws Act. For YIMBY and Choice, we continue to work on getting more co-sponsors to these bills. Having bipartisan support is the best way to get these bills considered and through the committee process and closer to the finish line of passage. I will continue to make this plea throughout the presentation, but we really do hope that you'll take advantage of all the ways that you can get involved in NAA's federal advocacy. It really does make a discernible difference, and we certainly need your help, as you'll see once we pivot to federal regulatory. There's so much ground truly to cover there. So let's start with an overview of the blueprint for those of you who may not be as familiar. As a way to honor President Biden's campaign promise from all the way back from 2020, he had promised as part of his housing agenda to enact a renter's Bill of Rights. With those opportunities to move his housing priorities through Congress, with those being very limited, all of his attention has moved to regulatory. Knowing that there would likely be divided government or certainly that the opportunities for the president to get his priorities passed through Congress, knowing those would close prior to 2023, we invested heavily in our federal regulatory program to prepare for this uptick in regulatory activity. What we didn't anticipate is the exponential and unprecedented actions and activity that we're seeing on the regulatory side. In January, the White House released its blueprint for a renter's Bill of Rights. This builds upon months of stakeholder discussions with renters' rights groups and industry groups like NAA. While we would have liked the White House and the administration to focus on their housing supply action plan, because we know that truly to make a difference in and take the pressure off of rents nationally, we need to build more housing. And the best way to do that is through solutions like the ones proposed in the Housing Supply Action Plan. Instead, what we're seeing is sort of a dual approach between the action plan and the blueprint. We were pleased to see that this process now moves to the agencies so that robust public comment can be had on these topics as the federal government is considering sweeping changes to federal housing policy rather than what renters' rights groups and even congressional leaders had urged them to do last year. Renters groups submitted a draft executive order to the White House for them to consider putting into place federal rent control immediately, among several other drastic policy changes. Because of NAA's advocacy, this was avoided. But moving forward, we need to make sure that the administration continues to hear from the industry about the impact of these potentially sweeping policy changes they're considering. So just to recap, what came out in January, it's 5 non-binding principles with 24 agency actions deriving from those principles. Our work has moved to 8 agencies, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and a continued commitment from the White House for activity on housing policy. So that's where all of our work began and continues to grow. For your awareness, these actions include both existing housing priorities that were well into the pipeline before the blueprint, but naturally fit in, and so they were included, plus the consideration, like I said, of new potentially significant policy changes. What we will see, and I'll talk more about this in the next slide, is that leading into the next election cycle, President Biden will want his administration to over-deliver to show the true value of his leadership as president. So you can expect much more activity in the months leading up to the election in their terms of intervening to protect renters. So again, this is what the outcome of the blueprint has been for the last 9 months. This has translated into a number of, again, our work has grown to expand to a number of agencies. And we're investing significant time and attention to make sure that the industry's voice is heard. This is just a handful of all of the activity that we're seeing. What started out as 24 commitments is now closer to 35. That list continues to grow, and like I said, we could be closer to 40 or 50 by the formal end to the blueprint activities. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we're continuing to, as I said, keep the pressure on and make sure that federal policymakers understand the serious implications of what they're considering. As I mentioned before, there are some things that were already in place that we're trying to work with them on, where we see some common ground, like helping put out information about the new Inspire inspection standards, which should, much like our investment in the Choice and Affordable Housing Act, help streamline the inspections process for HUD-assisted housing. On the one hand, we're helping assist with that and create a feedback loop so that housing providers do have a seat at the table and can provide real-time feedback to impact how Inspire standards and how that affects scoring moving forward. But the majority of our time is being spent on, across these agencies, tackling all of these issues that are coming about. Two that we're watching very closely and we've been very invested in is the requests for information from CFPB and FTC on resident screening and fees, and FHFA's consideration of nationalizing landlord and tenant requirements for enterprise-backed properties. They have said that they are also considering rent control as part of this process. As you can see on the screen, these are all very significant and could have significant challenges for the industry. They're equally important, but we are trying to make sure that we follow through the established processes to make sure that the industry's voice is heard for these individual scenarios. And a different strategy was needed to be tailored for each one of these. And we're continuing to do that even as the requests for information, those deadlines have passed. We made sure that the industry's voice was heard, and we continue to go back to them to get more information, to make sure we keep you up to date so that you're aware of what the ultimate outcome will be, and hopefully that the industry was able to influence that process at all stages along the way. So what do we think will happen? Certainly, as I said, the FHFA and CFPB FTC processes were top of mind for us this past year because those requests for information for public comment had a very specific time period. So we had to create strategies that align with those timelines and deadlines. We also are potentially watching for the fact that because source of income cannot be made a protected class through legislative channels, that they're going to try and put those requirements into place through regulatory channels as well. These are all things that we're watching. One of the main things I'm sure that is most top of mind for you is one, that CFPB and FTC are considering further limitations on the screening process, as well as further scrutinizing fees, particularly those that are attached to resident screening. We're still waiting on the outcome of the request for information there. But again, still making sure we take every opportunity to check in with those agencies, get an updated sense of their timeline so that we can keep you apprised when and if policy changes happen that would affect your business. The other main one is FHFA's consideration of putting into place federal landlord and tenant requirements for Fannie or Freddie backed properties. As part of this process, they did say that they are looking at potentially forward-facing rent control for enterprise-backed properties. And much like the pressure that the White House felt from advocates and congressional leaders before the blueprint came out, they are equally feeling that same pressure from those same groups to put into place rent control for enterprise-backed properties now that they've gone this route. We are making sure that we keep that pressure on as well to make sure that they understand the serious consequences, not just on housing providers, but on residents and the entire housing ecosystem in markets across the country if they were to put rent control into place. We, as part of our strategy with the request for information, we surveyed our members and made clear to them that over 78% of housing providers who use or plan to use enterprise-backed financing would stop doing so if renter protections were put into place. Certainly rent control being the most egregious. It's too early to tell what policy changes will result from that request for information, that forum for public comment, because FHFA had to push their timeline way out. They had anticipated making some sort of public announcement this fall, but they, and thank you to you, were inundated with public comments. Just NAA members sent over 3,000 e-letters to FHFA, letting them know the serious consequences of moving in this direction, plus the formal comments that NAA and NMHC provided them. We remain fully engaged on this issue. We just met with them, and they did convey to us that because of the unprecedented public engagement with this issue, they will likely be making no announcements between now and the end of the year. They have committed to reading every unique comment that they received, to which they received over 3,500. So we'll keep you apprised as things develop, but with everything you've seen so far on the federal regulatory side, there have been no changes to federal policy thus far, but we need to keep the pressure on and make sure they understand the severity of the consequences here if they were to move forward with their planned approach. So I showed you on the last kind of previous slides that they're considering nationalizing landlord and tenant, certainly limitations on resident screening, as well as highly scrutinizing fees as part of that process, tools that are used, technology that's used in resident screening and in rent setting, and potentially requiring source of income, which would mandate participation in the Section 8 program nationwide. All very serious issues. Again, there's no changes to federal policy at this point. We just want to make sure that we put this on your radar and keep you apprised as these things develop. And one thing that has continued to develop especially in the last couple of months, is the White House's interest in eliminating junk fees, or what they see as junk fees or hidden fees in rental housing. We have continued to engage the administration, both the White House and several agencies, to help them better understand rental costs and fees and why those are assessed, and why you can't have a one-size-fits-all policy to apply to all these different parts of housing providers' business. It's so critically tailored and unique to each jurisdiction, what the federal, state, and local requirements that overlay for that particular jurisdiction. That's why there can be no one-size-fits-all. We continue to emphasize that to them. We are seeing, though, that they're moving in this direction, into a direction of heightened scrutiny of fees and almost demanding of more transparency for renters in their costs, fees, and other charges at the outset, at move-in, and then what are those fees, costs, and charges throughout the life cycle of the tenancy. These are 4 best practices that HUD Secretary Fudge released in an open letter to the industry several months ago now. Again, these are just best practices, but they do indicate the direction that the federal government is going. HUD did acknowledge they have no authority to regulate the industry in terms of fees, but as you've seen with the CFPB and FTC requests for information, they do have that authority to regulate the industry, or they think they do, in the way that they would be protecting renters as consumers. So you could anticipate that there will be more coming from those agencies. Certainly FTC, who had an interest in regulating fees more stringently, this interest predated the blueprint and started last year in terms of protecting consumers from, as you can imagine, the hotel industry and ticket sales companies, the transparency challenges that folks are facing there. So this is a continuation of their sort of actually what the White House is calling their war on junk fees. So just be on the lookout for this. Certainly rental housing is being caught up in this. Again, as I said, all of these things are happening, but there continues in the last several months to be this heightened scrutiny on fees, and particularly what the administration is seeing as rental junk fees. There's no changes to federal housing policy at this time. Again, it's just mostly consideration of what's the feasibility if we were to put some of these things into place. Those are the conversations happening right now. But to the extent that this might help you as you assess your fees and policies and things in the future and how you operationalize potential upcoming federal policy changes, we wanted to put this on your radar. Specifically, application fees and convenience fees. These are topics which could invite additional scrutiny for housing providers because they're squarely on the radar of the White House. One additional area I would also suggest you keep in mind is admin fees as well. If you charge an application fee for the processing, or I'm sorry, if you charge an application fee to cover the cost of the criminal background check or the consumer report, plus an admin fee for the processing of that application, that might invite further scrutiny from the federal government. They're looking at these things through the lens of consumer protection laws, so just keep that in mind. While there's no changes right now to housing policy, there are already some laws on the books that could be reinterpreted to allow the federal government to further scrutinize housing providers in this area. I will put another flag on your radar as well, two. The blueprint also, while it is certainly focused on federal policy, was also a call to action to states to adopt landlord and tenant requirements that align with the principles of the blueprint. Here are some examples of, in their minds, good policy that they have proposed. We'll talk a little bit more about those examples later, but just wanted to make sure that since there's so much media attention around the blueprint, there will be downstream impacts from federal to state and local as well. And there has been talk about a Schumer box, a lot of conversation around this. If you're not familiar, you probably know it and have seen it, but didn't know that it was called a Schumer box. It's that summary of information at the beginning of your credit card that gives you a sense of what the fees would be if you got behind on your credit card, those sorts of things. There is a lot of conversation about whether that should be required for multifamily. So to the extent that this might impact, as you're reassessing leases and your policies and practices, might this be something you could think about in terms of putting some sort of summary at the beginning of your leases to get ahead of potentially what might be coming, to put a summary of key information at the front. Things to consider. So if you can believe it, there's more. I will be very quick so that we can talk about state and local and I can keep us on time. Two things that I wanted to make sure to put on your radar. First, you can always count on NAA to be your steadfast representative and your advocate in DC. The blueprint exponentially added to our work, certainly, but remember that we did a lot on your behalf prior to the blueprint, and that work continues. And so for you, it's just my reminder to all of you, it's equally important to remain apprised of non-blueprint related activity. Keep that on your radar for what that could, what kind of compliance impacts could be on your business from that. Two things to put on your radar before we do quickly state and local. HUD plans to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking and updated criminal screening guidance for HUD-assisted housing providers. At this time, what we're hearing from HUD is that they will not reissue or update the 2016 criminal screening guidance that any housing provider is required to abide by if you're subject to the Fair Housing Act. They are instead only moving forward with potential regulation that would impact HUD-assisted housing providers. Of course, it'll all be in the details, so we'll want to see what they come up with, but wanted to put that on your radar. There will be rulemaking and criminal screening guidance that may change your compliance responsibilities around screening coming soon. The EPA also announced a proposed rule that would significantly lower allowable dust levels in buildings. The EPA's new standard proposes that any finding of lead in the home would result in a classification of lead hazard. Understanding this could certainly increase your costs for lead remediation and the potential consequences, downstream consequences of that on the cost of housing. We're on it. That's all I can say, is that we're continuing to be your voice in these discussions. We understand the tremendous impacts that this could have on the industry. We are in the process of submitting comments with our coalition partners by the October 2nd deadline, but just, keep this on your radar. We'll be back in touch with you when a final rule is put into place to be able to offer resources to help navigate these new requirements as they come down. One more shameless plug. As I said, you can always count on us to be your steadfast representative and advocate in DC, but please consider getting more involved. As I said, there's a discernible difference in our advocacy and the success of our advocacy when you participate. Federal policymakers, they hear from us all the time. They know who to contact if they have a question on rental housing, but they really do need to hear from you. You're their constituents. On the screen, you'll see all of the ways that you can help advance the industry's federal advocacy. And I highly encourage you to participate in whatever way that you can. Would always urge you to donate to the PAC to make sure that we continue to have those touch points throughout the year, to make sure that we have a seat at the table in these policy discussions. We want to make sure to know if you're a key contact and you have any personal relationships with members of Congress or their staffs that can help us advance our advocacy priorities. As I said, you can see there were many areas on this translates into slide where federal regulatory policy could have an impact on your business. We hope you don't get fatigued. It's really important that you participate in those calls to action. They really do make a difference. And as I said, with FHFA, they understood the unprecedented nature of this because of the incoming that they received, and they're taking that feedback seriously. As well, we are always doing meetings with policymakers, particularly on the regulatory side. Now that we always did this, but now it's for a broader group of agencies. So we need an even larger group of subject matter experts who can talk to us about what's happening in the field and can convey those on the ground insights and observations about the industry to policymakers directly. So let's talk really briefly about state and local. I mentioned this to you previously, that the White House put out a call to action to states to say you should adopt policies in line with the blueprint. The underlying themes of the enacted and proposed legislation on the previous slide that they're proposing to their counterparts at the state level, the common themes you'll see at the top. They want renters to be allowed to use a rental application reuse a rental application without additional costs. That's that idea of portability that started out of Seattle and has been spreading. They also want to see limits on application fees beyond actual costs, and potentially requiring a refund following an unsuccessful application. We continue to educate them on why these are not practical considerations, but just keep on your radar that these are things that are being suggested to state from the federal government to their state counterparts. The ones to watch, I would say, are two bills. Certainly they would have significant implications if this one law and one piece of legislation were to spread in more parts of the country, is having these prohibited lease provisions. They have such drastic implications that that first one, characterizing any amount as rent that the government does not agree is rent, certainly affects what's ultimately recoverable in the eviction process. And wanted to make sure you keep on your radar the proposed Senate Bill 611. These new advertising standards would take a very straightforward advertisement and make them so complicated as to be unworkable. Essentially requiring that if you promote the rent in your advertisement, then you need to essentially create a diagram of the total range of costs that they may be required to pay at move-in, and then also throughout the tenancy. So these would have significant implications if they were to spread. In terms of state and local trends, I wanted to put a few things on your radar. Of course, rent control is of greatest concern. NAA tracks state and local legislation across the country. We, as you can imagine, there's so much activity there and thousands of localities. It would be hard for us to be comprehensive, but we want to make sure that we're covering the issues that would have the most significance from a national perspective. And we want to make sure that we're keeping a pulse on the issues that you care about most. So you will see tracking tools on our website that allow you to keep up with what we're tracking. So to the extent that this will ultimately impact your business, you could at least get a heads up on what we're seeing. Two things I want to put on your radar. Certainly, we're watching really closely and supporting our friends in our affiliate network all around the country who are working to defeat rent control, as well as initiatives that would remove rent control preemptions, which are laws that prevent localities, state laws that prevent localities from enacting rent regulation policies. We are heavily involved in those, and supporting our affiliates is needed. 3 hotspots that I would put on your radar are California, where this is now the 3rd attempt in 4 election cycles to remove the rent control limitations at the state level that prevent the floodgates of rent control from opening to local governments. That is in the works now and has qualified for the November 5th ballot. In Illinois, the Lift the Ban campaign, which is the years-long advocates pro-rent control campaign to remove the rent control preemption in the state. They announced the introduction of HB 4104, which would allow municipalities to pass rent control by ballot initiative. We are continuing to support and commend our friends at the Chicagoland Apartment Association and their coalition partners in the Shape Illinois campaign, who are instead keeping the focus on pro-housing legislation that would address the significant gap in housing supply that's desperately needed in the state. You can expect that no actions will be taken up on HB 4104 until January of 2024, when the Illinois General Assembly session will begin. Massachusetts is another one that we're very closely watching. They have had hotly contested battles over rent control in the state for many years, which have become much more heated in the last couple of years, with the governor of Boston being pro-rent control. A statewide ballot initiative has been filed to allow municipalities to enact price controls, as well as to set their own rules on eviction. That rent control question has been certified by the Attorney General. Now the pro-rent control advocates need 90,000 valid signatures to qualify for the November 5th, 2024 ballot. In this, of course, as I've said, we commend the efforts of our friends at the Massachusetts Apartment Association and their coalition partners, who've already launched the Rent Control Hurts Housing campaign. And we hope that if you own, operate, develop, invest in any of these states, that you will help contribute to these efforts to prevent the spread of rent control. Very quickly, I want to also put on your radar that you should be just as weary of just cause eviction. Certainly that is bad policy on its face, but of the New York style of just cause eviction that is spreading. Good cause in New York would presume that any increase of more than 3% or 1.5 times the regional inflation rate, whichever is higher, is unreasonable, as defined by this proposed state law. The advocates have been trying to push just cause piecemeal, going municipality to municipality. But at the same time, they have also continued to push for this statewide, for a statewide mandate. Just putting this on your radar, certainly it's something that that when looked at more closely, and certainly our friends in the state apartments of New York are making sure to highlight this, that this is actually not just bad policy, but it's also rent control by another name. So keep a close eye on that, and should that spread elsewhere as well. Let's end on a high note, shall we? Mark your calendars for September 26th. On September 26th, the Supreme Court will decide whether it will hear two significant rent control cases, Chip versus New York City and 74 Pinehurst. If the cert petition is accepted by the Supreme Court, their decision ultimately could overturn New York City's rent stabilization law, considering the current makeup of the court. Most importantly, these cases hold the potential to shape the trajectory of rent control nationwide, because it could also establish a precedent for rent control regulations to be contingent upon SCOTUS review in the future. We are strong supporters of CHIP and 74 Pinehurst petition for review. If you'd like to read more about, read our brief, which we developed in consultation with our coalition partners. I encourage you to read it. You'll have access to this and all of my slides after this session. So just as a reminder, as I close here, we are here to help. We hope you'll continue to use NAA as a resource. I tried to pack in a lot of information into this brief, running a bit over 45-minute webinar. But if you want to get more information on a regular basis, we do these types of webinars with the latest advocacy and legal information that is important to you. We do these webinars every third Wednesday of the month at 3:30 Eastern Time. We hope you'll tune in, hopefully continue to use us as a resource. If you want to deep dive on any of the issues that I talked about today, or any of the issues that you might hear on our monthly ALW, that information is in our Apartment Advocate or our Apartment Advocate Pro e-newsletters that we send out every 2 weeks. So there are many ways for you to get more information and to stay in the loop. And please remember, our advocacy is only as strong as having your voice be a part of it. Our advocacy is best when we are using one strong, loud voice. So please do consider getting involved. Your participation is critically important. So on that note, I want to thank you again for your time. We'll continue to keep up the good fight to ensure the brightest possible future for the rental housing industry. But again, please do consider getting more involved in advocacy. We really do need you. Please feel free again to use NAA or myself as a resource at any time, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. So take care, and thanks again.